And for the first segment today, a news item that I've been teasing for the past couple of weeks, I will be getting deep in the weeds this morning regarding the case of Sean Duvall. Sean Duvall is a Navy veteran who served during Operation Desert Storm. He faced quite a few challenges last summer, culminating with loss of a job, homelessness, and a general feeling at coming to the end of the line. And while he was feeling suicidal, he called the VA crisis line. Long story short, the crisis line helped him and talked Sean Duvall out of suicide. However, it is a long story. So to share the long story and provide some meaningful insight from what it was like there in Roanoke, Virginia, where all this went down, I'm joined by a reporter for the Roanoke Times who covered this story in great detail, wrote several articles about it earlier this year. Laurence Hammack is on the phone from us from Roanoke, Virginia. And from there, can you hear me, Laurence?
Yes, I can.
Well, thank you so much for joining us this morning. I really appreciate that.
Sure.
And tell us, before we get into the weeds, give us a brief background about yourself. Are you a Virginia native? How long have you been a reporter? All that.
I am. I grew up on the eastern side of the state. Roanoke is in the western portion of the state, the more mountainous region. I have been a reporter for the Roanoke Times for a little bit more than 25 years now. My current assignment, I cover federal courts, and I am a general assignment reporter.
Excellent. So let's share a little bit of background about what happened with Sean Duvall. This all happened last summer. And one of the questions, actually, what I'm going to ask before we get into the details of this, because this all happened last summer, but all the news reporting on it seems to have happened earlier this year. Is that all because all of the court activity happened earlier this year, or was it just overlooked last summer? What was the story with that?
Well, it started off as something that easily could have been overlooked. It was only after the federal investigation ramped up in late last year, I believe October or November, Mr. Duvall was indicted. It did not generate an article at that point. I was aware generally of the case. I didn't know all the details. The full story, as it was later reported, really didn't come out until February of this year, when Randy Cargill, an assistant federal public defender who represents Mr. Duvall, filed a motion to dismiss the charges against him,
right,
which at that point were possession of a destructive device and other related felonies.
Exactly, and actually, I have a rundown of that. And for the record, both Mr. Cargill's office and the prosecutor's office, Mr. Heafy, both have views that they would like to express regarding this case. However, the case technically in their eyes is still open, even though they've reached a settlement, and and Sean Duvall is going through the process of that settlement. Technically, the case is still open, so they are reluctant to talk about it on the record for now. But we'll touch basically what happened real quick. Sean Duvall basically lost his job, lost his apartment, gave his last remaining pennies to his wife, and then hit the streets for about a week. Laurence, take it from there about what he did for that week coming up to the point where he called the VA crisis line.
Sure. In the weeks before the first week of June, he was becoming increasingly depressed for the reasons that you just detailed. He constructed a very rude device that consisted of a steel pipe, a 12-gauge shotgun shell, and a nail that would serve as a firing pin if he chose to detonate the device, which basically he'd have to do about standing next to a wall or other hard surface and slam the device against the wall, causing the nail to discharge the shotgun shell. And
right.
It was his intent. He has later detailed in the court records filed by his attorney that he was suicidal and specifically made that device through just a couple of trips to Lowe's and Home Depot for the materials, in full anticipation that he would use it to take his own life.
Right, and for those that aren't getting a visual on this, it was basically a device where you had I guess the pipe was about 8 inches in length. He had a shotgun shell inside of it, and then he fashioned a mechanism for which a nail would operate as a firing pin. And the idea being is that the way to discharge this would be to hold the pipe at the base of your hand, and with the firing pin near the base of your hand, stand in front of it and then jam the base of that pipe up against a wall or something, thereby discharging the shell and then committing suicide in a rather violent fashion. So for those that are trying to understand the nature of how the device would work, not very good at trying to fend off an intruder because you'd have no way to aim the device or use it in an offensive fashion, I would argue.
Right.
So he ended up calling the VA crisis line after spending, I guess, a certain amount of time with that crisis counselor. She went on to convince him that he shouldn't commit suicide, and he agreed with that.
That's right.
And then he found himself pretty much at that point on the campus of Virginia Tech.
Very close. He was technically he was in the parking lot of the university's International Student Center, which is not part of the contiguous campus. It is about 2 blocks away from the actual campus per se, but because it was Tech property, it's been described as part of the campus, and I think that's a relevant point to all of this is that all this happened in Blacksburg, Virginia, about 45 minutes from Roanoke, and as most people know, Blacksburg and Virginia Tech was the scene 5 years ago this month of the worst shooting, mass shooting in U.S. history, and as the events played out following that night last June, I think that setting had a lot to do with what happened next.
Right, and obviously it would touch the emotions for those that are sensitive to that area and the events that had happened 5 years ago at Virginia Tech for sure. No argument there.
Sure.
He ended up surrendering to an officer. The officer took his backpack where he had that device. It didn't have the nail in it, so it was pretty much inert, I guess you could argue, and he had some other papers in there. He surrendered to the officer. They then took him to a hospital, and he underwent treatment for several days, as I understand it, correct?
That's right. They issued what's known in Virginia as a temporary detention order, which a police officer or a magistrate can do if there is evidence that an individual, through their mental condition at the time, posed a threat either to themselves or to others. I think in this case, most would agree that any threat that Mr. Duvall posed was only to himself.
Sure, and that's what I'm gleaning from the various articles I've read, as well as portions of the motion to dismiss from Mr. Cargill during that hearing. And here's the interesting part. So he comes out of treatment. He ends up feeling better, not feeling the urge to commit suicide. And apparently then went on where he was able to find work again, got employable, I guess is the operative word, then was able to find a job. And then he had a follow-on hearing sometime later because the state of Virginia was going to hit him with a misdemeanor. Is that correct?
That's right. The charge, he was actually charged briefly with carrying a concealed weapon.
Right, without a license. So a misdemeanor, in the worst case, which wouldn't have been in this case because for all practical intents and purposes, he could have been facing maybe a year in prison if everything went against him for this misdemeanor, and I don't think anybody would expect that he was going to serve any prison time based off of that misdemeanor or have much of a fine.
Right, that's fair to say,
sure.
Compared to other cases.
Exactly. So when he showed up to this hearing where he thought it was going to be a case against the state and his defender was probably going to plead this whole thing down, what ended up happening is the state's prosecutor ended up filing a motion to drop the charges, and the reason being is because the Department of Justice itself, the feds, decided to do their own investigation, and they decided to slap him with 4 felony counts.
That's right.
And I have a list of them here. It was possessing a destructive device manufactured in violation of federal law, possessing an unregistered firearm, manufacturing a destructive device, and possessing a destructive device without a serial number. So each of these, in their own right, carries a potential 10-year prison sentence, and who knows, what other problems those charges cause. You were at these hearings, correct?
Yes, I was.
So what was it? What was the mood like at the time? Sitting in these hearings when you saw this go down. What was the reasons given, or what was the mood, and how what was the prosecuting attorneys for the feds' reason for trying to get involved in this when it looked like, I mean, it was a localized issue. Local cops took care of it. He went to a local hospital, local. All of a sudden, Department of Justice steps in and slaps a big sledgehammer on the whole thing. What was the reasoning at the time there when you were there at the hearing?
Yeah, well, that's a good question, and all those questions were made by the counsel for Mr. Duvall. The government, in its defense, has said in court that they did not swoop in and take this case as some might believe, but they said that they, in fact, were contacted by the state authorities, partly because of the danger that this, legally they call it a destructive device, but this homemade gun, partly because of the danger that it posed, and also they said publicly that part of their concern, once they were alerted to the case, asked by the state authorities to step in, and of course they have resources such as ATF, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, to do an analysis of this device, that they decided to take the case for an investigation, and a large part of, I think, their rationale was the history of where this happened. Had the exact same circumstances played out involving Mr. Duvall in Roanoke as opposed to Blacksburg, they were only separated by 45 minutes, but I think it's likely that the outcome would have been much different. And again, that all goes back to the heightened sensitivity among law enforcement here to the incident that happened 5 years ago on the Tech campus.
That's interesting. So naturally, and I won't commentate on who contacted whom because I wasn't there. You guys were, and all that kind of stuff. Although I'll go without saying that I'm rather suspicious of that assertion from the feds, unfortunately. But we'll leave that for another conversation months down the road, I guess.
Sure.
The end result, though, is so now the feds were managed to get 4 indictments against Sean Duvall in this case.
Right.
And so then Randy Cargill, the federal defender for Sean Duvall in this case, then filed a motion to dismiss. That hearing was also in February, correct?
Correct.
And so he filed a 35-page motion. If I remember, he sent me a copy of it. It was 35 pages long. I didn't print the whole thing, but I did read some highlighted points talking about his service record, as well as some of the context by which that when you call the VA crisis line, or when you call any crisis line for that matter, the auspices are that your case is handled confidentially, and then the assumption could be made that what you reveal under the auspices of confidentiality would not be used against you later on. That seemed to rile up. I know it riled up a lot of the veterans groups. One of the folks that we were going to talk with on this program today, and of course because of scheduling problems, we weren't able to get it all together, was the Roanoke Valley Veterans Council. And so we've been talking about this off and on now for weeks, and we will discuss with them later on down the road as well. So aside from obviously the veterans groups being rather incensed at how this developed, what were some of the reactions from other folks in the area to your recollection, Laurence?
I think it was a fair amount of local reaction from mostly veterans. There was some concern expressed in mental health treatment circles that this potentially could have a chilling effect on people who reach out for a crisis helpline, whether it's one run by the Department of Veteran Affairs or some other auspice, that it's always, I think, difficult for people who are in a situation where they're dealing with their own mental issues to take that step to reach out and ask for help. All too often, I think, people sort of internalize these types of things to their detriment, and,
Sure.
and the concern that that we heard from the professionals in the mental health treatment field was that this would have a chilling effect. It would discourage people from seeking the very kind of help that these crisis lines have been shown to provide over and over again.
Exactly, and for those that don't know, the VA's crisis line was started in 2007, and since then has taken in probably a little over 250,000 calls, and they're credited with saving probably 20,000 lives in that time. And right now, we're the metrics indicate that about 18 veterans a day commit suicide. So there's certainly relevance to having the Veterans Crisis Line available to people. You haven't been able to interview Sean Duvall directly yet, have you?
I spoke to him very briefly after the last hearing in the case, in which technically the charge has not been dismissed. The judge granted a mutual request by both the prosecution and the defense to continue it for 6 months in order for Mr. Duvall to enroll in a treatment program specifically tailored for veterans.
Right, and that's part of the Virginia's
in that program.
And that's part of Virginia's Veterans Treatment Court, which they've set up across the state, I believe. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, actually, it's just for the western half of the state.
Understood.
It's a brand new program. Well,
Gotcha.
It's been in existence for about a year,
right.
So it's almost brand new.
But it's young and is set up, and there's precedents all over the country. There's veterans courts printing up everywhere. So
right.
when he's done with this program in about 6 months here on Veteran Radio, I know his public defender, Mr. Cargill, has indicated that he would like to share his insights about the case. Mm-hmm. The prosecutor's office, Mr. Heafy's office, and their public affairs group has indicated that they would like to share some information and some insights as well. So
right.
When Sean Duvall is done with this whole program, I'm hoping we'll have the opportunity maybe even to talk with him. And I know we'll have the Roanoke Valley Veterans Council on the program in the near future. And all of these stories, Laurence, you wrote 3 rather detailed stories on the Roanoke Times. All of these can be found on Roanoke.com. Laurence, I want to thank you very much for joining us on the program this morning and sharing some insight about what happened with Sean Duvall and some of the implications that we have to consider now when it comes to these types of crises.
It was my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And so with that, Sean Duvall is not out of the woods yet. He is in the process of completing the Veterans Treatment Court, and we will discuss what veterans courts mean all over the country and what they mean here in California as well. And despite all this, Sean Duvall credits the VA crisis line with saving his life. So it is worth taking that into consideration. If you are having issues and are weary of calling the crisis line, call somebody. That's the key when it comes down to it. And if you want to know what that Veterans Crisis Line number is, you can reach that anytime at 800-273-8255 and press option 1. That gets you right to the front of the line. That's 800-273-8255. And so we'll deal with that here. Coming into the next segment, we'll give a recap of what's going on into the second half of the program, and we will keep monitoring this case with Sean Duvall in Virginia going forward. You are listening to Veteran Radio.